So today's presentation on the myth of progress, named after the book here that our speaker wrote, will be given by the author, Tom Wessels. He's a terrestrial ecologist and professor emeritus at Antioch University, where he founded the master's degree program in conservation biology, and where we regularly send graduates of our program to continue on for a graduate study. One of those alums, Jason Brown, is the reason why Tom's here tonight, because he made the recommendation and helped put me in touch. So thank you, Jason, if you ever watch this. I don't usually provide much biographical information, but I wanted to note two things about our presenter. So he's the author of numerous books, including Reading the Forested Landscape, which I incorporate every year into the first course that our environmental studies students take here at MCLA, and which I highly recommend. You'll never see the forest in the same way afterwards. And then I'm not sure if Tom remembers, but he came to MCLA over a decade ago, and he led a walk in our MCLA forest, and he spent less than an hour there. He pointed out the one small area that he said was probably cultivated in the past. And in our 10 years plus of digging soil pits throughout the whole forest, he has been proved entirely correct. So thank you, Tom. So rather than being a lecture, tonight's presentation is going to be in the form of a conversation per Tom's request. And so many of you have read this book, and if you haven't, don't worry, we're going to be talking about a bunch of the ideas that he presents in it. I'll be asking a number of questions, and then I'll ask questions that the students in this course submitted. So without further ado, thank you so much, Tom, for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
All right, is the volume okay, everybody? Okay, I don't think I hit record. Record to this computer or the cloud? Tyler, what are we doing? The cloud, great. All right.
Recording in progress.
There we go. All right, so there we go. There, you can see me again. Tom, you wrote in your book that some of your inspiration for writing this book came from a quote by George W. Bush. Economic growth is key to environmental progress. And so this is an idea that we discuss in an environmental policy class I teach, and it always generates lots of interesting debate. And so before delving into like all the specific arguments in your book, I'm just wondering if your perspective has changed at all over time about this prevailing paradigm that economic growth is key to environmental progress.
No, I don't think it's changed at all. Matter of fact, I think it's gotten reinforced by what we've seen playing out, I'd say, over the last decade or so. So, yeah, it was a striking quote, because it seems to me that the more we've, had economic growth, the more environmental degradation we've seen. We haven't seen the reverse, and that's still happening right now as we really see climate change really starting to kick in. And we're seeing dramatic losses in biotic diversity, and it's all because of this economic growth. So, no, I haven't changed my feelings about that at all.
Then let's delve into some of the specific arguments for this stance. And so the first chapter of your book goes into some detail describing what complex systems are. And describing some of their key characteristics. So could you start us off with explaining what is a complex system?
Well, a complex system it's actually pretty simple. It's just a system where the parts within it don't interact in a lockstep way. So part A could interact with part B under certain circumstances, or it could interact with part F or part G or whatever else. A linear system, like let's say a wind-up clock or a car engine, the parts work in a lockstep way. So part A is always interacting with part B, and that makes them quite predictable. Like on a clock, you know how many times the gears turn around, you can predict what the time will be on the face of the clock. But in a complex system, that predictability sort of goes out the window, because there are all these feedback loops that are happening in the system, so you can never pin down exactly what the system will be doing at any point in time. And so that's basically the difference.
And one of the examples that you gave about a complex system is this butterfly effect. Could you explain what is the butterfly effect?
Well, I mean, I don't really know if it occurs, but it was something like this idea. It was just a sort of an analogy or an example. I don't think it really exists per se, but it just means that a butterfly flapping, somewhere in the planet sets up a minor air current that gets amplified and eventually starts affecting weather systems. I don't really think that's the case, but what it's saying is, basically we cannot predict the weather now. We might be able to get it a week out, but further than that, we can't, because the system is constantly feeding back on itself. And after a week's time, the whole thing has changed from what it was a week before.
So when I was reading your book, I was really intrigued to think about not just natural systems as being complex systems, but also some of our social systems as being complex systems. Could you explain a little bit more about that line of thinking?
Yeah, all of our human systems are complex because we can interact with different people in different ways at different time. We can't predict how those interactions are going to play out because, like this webinar tonight, there was some glitches getting it going and there's no way to predict that. And so we're doing catch up and everything else. So anything that humans interact in with each other is a complex system. So classes you can never predict exactly how a class is going to go or what's going to come up in a conversation. Organizations are complex. Our economy is a complex system. All these things are complex. And the reason I'm mentioning it is one of the ruling ideas behind that statement that George Bush made was that in a linear system, you can predict what it's going to do in the future because it's going to do exactly what it's done in the past. That is not the case in a complex system. You can't predict how it's going to behave in the future because its behavior is predicated on everything that's leading up to that, and that can change at any point in time.
Yeah, and I think another takeaway was, in addition to the lack of being able to predict the behavior of complex systems, it was also a myth that we would be able to control them, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you can't control a complex system. Sometimes you try to control it and you get outcomes that are completely not what you're looking for. So, a lot of our foreign policy is acted in this way. We're trying to get particular outcomes and the results are not always what we hope for or what we imagined. Because again, it's complex and you can't predict what's going to happen.
So you made the point that it was important to understand the sort of differences in our society and our awareness and our interaction with natural resources back when classical economic theory was developed, and how different that is now, and how important it is to understand the differences in the time period when this classical mode of economic mode of thought that as sort of part of our prevailing paradigm was developed. Can you tell us a little bit more about those differences and why they're important to appreciate?
Well, I'm not sure where you're going with this, but I think one thing I will say is that there are certain scientific laws that apply to any system, and one of them I think is really important to discuss here is the second law of thermodynamics. There's two laws of thermodynamics. The first law states that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. That's a pretty powerful idea. It means all the energy in the universe today is exactly what it was down to the microjoule, 14 billion years ago. But it's from a sustainability standpoint, which gets us to looking at capitalism and sustainability. It's the second law that is really the foundational law, because what it's stating is that although we can't create or destroy energy, we can transform it from one form to another. So right now in your classroom, as well as my room here, electricity is coming in and it's being transformed into light so we can see each other. That light, when it hits an object in the room, then gets transformed into heat. So energy can't be created or destroyed, but it can be transformed. But the key to this law is that within a system where a transformation occurs, there's always energy loss in that transformation. And what that means is for any system that is taking in less energy than it's releasing from its, basically its transformations, that system is said to become entropic. And that means as it bleeds off energy, it becomes simplified and its energy and materials become diffused. And of course, that's what's going on in the biosphere right now. Our economic system predicated on growth is amping up every year the amount of energy we are transforming in that economic system. And right now, we are releasing way more heat from all those transformations created by humans in our economic system than is being replaced by energy absorbed from sunlight through the process of photosynthesis. So what we see is everywhere we look, the biosphere is becoming entropic. Every system we look at, they're becoming simplified. Species extinctions are part of this. Clear cutting of tropical rainforests to make way for plantations of sugarcane or things like that is simplifying those very complex systems. We're seeing energy and materials being diffused. A good example, combusting carbon fuels is a process. We're taking concentrated storage of carbon and diffusing it out in the atmosphere. And so this law is basically why our current idea of our economic system is always growing is completely unfounded and absolutely wrong. It's not following basic scientific law, and we're getting further and further down the road of seeing major problems because of it.
And so you stated this rule of thumb in your book that struck me and at least a couple other students. Said whenever you're trying to make the right environmental decision, just contemplate which action will generate the least amount of energy transformations. That will almost always be your right choice. So any other sort of examples or kind of follow up, it leads, from what you're talking about with regards to entropy?
Well, yeah. One of the big problems is, we can do a lot individually to reduce our energy use, but so much of this is embedded in the system itself. So, one of the rules of thumb is that basically economic efficiency is looked at how much, product or service can be produced per unit of human labor. So businesses are always trying to decrease human labor because it makes them more economically efficient and makes them more profitable. So the way they do this is by mechanizing. And this is supposed to be a great thing for the economy, but it's a terrible thing for the biosphere because once you mechanize, you become super energy inefficient. So let me just give an example. Over in Greenfield, there's a brew pub called the People's Pint. It was started by one of my former graduate students. I haven't been there in a while, but the last time I was there, they only had one beef entree on their menu. It was a hamburger, a cheeseburger. That beef was locally supplied by a grass-grown beef farmer about 10 miles from Greenfield. Now, I want you to think about the embedded energy in that hamburger meat. There's going to be some because he has a tractor which cuts hay for wintertime feed, spreads manure. He's put up fencing. There's embedded energy in that fencing. He's got a barn that he heats. There's embedded energy there. But I'd like you now to contemplate the amount of embedded energy, let's say, in a McDonald's hamburger. So right away, the beef that comes to make McDonald's hamburgers are not grass-fed, they're grain-fed. And right away, that almost boosts tenfold the amount of embedded energy going into producing that hamburger meat. But not only that, those steers are shipped thousands of miles to go to slaughterhouses where they are killed, and then machines take over, grind up the meat, machines make the patties, machines box the patties, machines move the patties to freezers, then that frozen patties are shipped hundreds of miles to distribution centers and then shipped out to the outlet stores. Now, when I say embedded energy, I want you to think about, let's say if we're talking about machines doing this work, it's not just the energy they're using, like electricity or diesel, which there's a lot of in that example, but it's all the energy that went into extracting all the materials, refining it, making the parts, building the machines, moving them around. Our system is super energy inefficient because of this huge amount of mechanization. If we could really have an economic system that was much more local or regional, where you had smaller scale entities that weren't mechanized, we'd save huge amounts of energy from transportation and all that embedded energy. So That's just an example of how, we might be economically efficient, but we are going out of the roof in terms of our energy consumption. And that's all embedded in the system because it's a crazy system that doesn't acknowledge basic scientific laws.
So another factor that you describe is thinking about the resilience of our economic system when compared to natural systems, sort of looking at which natural systems are more or less resilient. Are there, in addition to sort of looking at so energy transformations, wasted energy, sort of the infrastructure, are there other characteristics that you think about in terms of considering how resilient a natural or social system is?
Yeah, so in natural systems, and I'll just use an example of like an ecosystem through evolutionary time. Through evolutionary time, natural systems are being driven by energy efficiency. Energy is a finite resource out there. So any organism that develops a strategy or an adaptation that makes it more energy efficient means it can support a larger population on the same fixed amount of energy. And energy inefficient organisms are basically selected out of the scene, just the opposite of what's happening in our economy. So what this does is through time, as species adjust their ecologies to be more energy efficient, it causes them to become more specialized, their ecological roles get smaller, and through times, ecosystems build up more and more biotic diversity. And what this leads to is a lot of repetition of function in critical functional roles. So if we look at, let's say, decomposition out there in our forests around here, we don't have a handful of species. We've got tens of thousands of different decomposers out there doing that job. If we're looking at pollination, like if you got a wildflower field here in New England, you went out and cataloged all the insects pollinating through the whole bloom season from, basically April through to November, we'd find well over 1,000 of different insect pollinators. The same thing with, photosynthetic plants. And what this means is having all this repetition of function. If any one species goes extinct, the system is fine because it has so many other players doing the exact same role. We're doing just the opposite in our economy. It doesn't matter what sector you look at. It could be financial, it could be media, it could be pharmaceuticals, agriculture, energy. It doesn't matter. You're going to find that the bulk of the capital is going through a handful of very, very large corporate enterprises. And that means there's not much resiliency there, because if any of those enterprises start to fail, the system really starts to have big problems. So a good example of this was the financial meltdown of 2008. At that time, the 10 largest banks in this country had 54% of all the banking assets in the United States. That was a huge concentration of capital in just 10 entities. And when Lehman Brothers bellied up, the federal government had to rush in to shore up the system because it would have cascaded through all the big banks. Now, what's ironic about this is because of all the bank closures that happened at that time that got swallowed up by the remaining banks, the last time I looked, the 10 biggest banks in the country now hold 82% of all the capital, which means the system is even less resilient and more fragile than it was in 2008. I don't know what the next catalyst will be, but if there's another catalyst, like the risky investments that started the problem in 2008, it's going to be a much worse situation than it was in 2008 because we've moved away from really decentralizing all those critical roles and concentrating them. And that's happening throughout our economy. And you can see the impact of that now with supply chains dynamics with this pandemic. A good example was with baby formula. 40% of baby formula was manufactured in just one plant in Michigan in this country. And when that plant closed, that was it. All of a sudden, there wasn't enough baby formula, and it became a really serious shortage, which was life-threatening. So just an example of that.
So I'm going to go through several of these questions that are related that came from the students. The first, I think, that follows from what you're saying is that changes to this economic system can't happen overnight. So what do you see as the first place to start in order to implement these changes that we need to see?
Well, in all complex systems, large scale change bubbles up from the bottom. So if you look at all of our social change movements, women's suffrage, civil rights, same sex marriage, these things all came from the citizens and bubbled up to change the governmental system. So we can't really look, I don't think, to the government to change things. It's got to be the citizens that start it and really take the ball. So that means, I think, what we need to do is we need to decentralize our economic system. It needs to go back to be much more local and regional with many, many more economic entities that are not heavily, based on, having, machines doing the work, but people doing the work. And that aren't all in competition, that actually can have mutually beneficial relationships. When Adam Smith first wrote, The Wealth of Nations, and he's considered the father of modern capitalism, he was looking at a pre-industrial merchant economy where you had a butcher, a baker, a blacksmith, a brewer. And these were very specialized entities, the way species are in ecosystems. They're all merchants, but they weren't competing because the butcher just sell meat and the blacksmith just sell metal, and the blacksmith would sell knives to the butcher and butcher would sell meat to the blacksmith. And in this way, they were mutually supporting each other. So I think we need to go back to small, local, regional entities that are not mechanized heavily, that are integrated in ways where they're supporting each other and creating this very resilient network. And that means citizens have to support that. We've got to start throwing our money to our local businesses and away from the large corporate one, and really work with municipalities and work at the state level to really create incentives to relocalize and regionalize our economies to make them way more energy efficient and way more resilient.
So another student asked, are you encouraged by the recent political changes in Brazil with the election of Lula da Silva and his promises to protect the Amazon rainforest? Or do you think Lula's efforts are too late, considering the foothold of Brazil's logging and ranching industries within politics?
Well, I'm going to take a wait and see attitude on that. I mean, I hear that. I embrace what he's saying. The question is, will it pan out or not? I don't know. There's a lot of inertia in this whole economic system. It's not like you can turn it around all at once. We have to change it from the bottom up, and we have to do it as quickly as we can. And so I'm not that enamored by top-down changes, but I haven't really seen them happening. I've heard about them, but I haven't seen them happening. So we'll have to wait and see.
I have a few more, but I will get to audience questions also. So do think if there's some questions that you want to offer. So another question, how do you think we can communicate the environmentally destructive aspects of capitalism to those who may identify with it on a political basis? Those who identify as politically conservative may shudder at the thought of any economic system being integrated in the United States, of another economic system being integrated in the United States. So how can we distance this issue from politics and communicate the environmental faults of capitalism using pragmatic, easy to understand language that is not divisive?
It's hard. I mean, what makes it hard is our society has changed pretty dramatically in the last few decades, where the general populace gets the bulk of their information in sound bites, often through social media, which, you don't know where that information is coming from. It takes time to really have a good discussion, to really get into stuff like this. You can't just do it quickly. It takes time. And a lot of the people just don't seem to have the time. So I'm not sure how we do it. It's hard. I think one thing that I've sort of seen that's really interesting is there's an entity up here where I live that's called Open Table. And once a week, they just have a community meal. And it's a very good meal. You can, be, food insecure and go, but you could be wealthy and go. It doesn't matter. Anyone who wants to come, comes, and you sit down. And the idea is to get people in the room who normally would not be together at all. And they might have very different political views or whatever. And usually that's not talked about, but it's sort of sensed that people might have different views. But what everyone starts to realize is they're all citizens in the same community. And that by coming together like that, it makes for a better community. So I think in some ways, we've got to figure out ways to do that first and then take the next step of talking about like this system and the problems with it, because you can't just do it outright, because people will. They'll just re-entrench in their political stance and just shuts down conversation.
I really like that example. We don't have anything that I'm aware of quite like that around here, so maybe we should learn from that example. Another student's question was with regards to what students can do on a college campus to help kind of affect these kinds of changes.
Well, I guess, find out what the systems are. If you can find out what the systems are, then you can start really making suggestions of how to change them. So that's where I'd start. I'd start to understand, okay, where's stuff coming from? What are the transportation systems? Who's involved? How can we do this? How are buildings being heated? Things like that. So it's going to take some time and effort to really know the systems. Then you can start to see, well, here's a point where we can intervene and maybe do something that would make it better.
So on the flip side, we also had a student who wanted to know, we talk about simplification and loss of biodiversity. So what is your biggest worry? Also, to put this in perspective, one of the characteristics that you wrote about regarding complex systems is this idea of tipping points and phase shifts, right? So as you look at our sort of global status and challenges conserving biodiversity, where are your biggest fears focused at the moment?
I guess, probably it would be related to climate change. That is that's our largest single problem. I mean, and it has so many impacts on so many other things. So right now, I mean, one thing I'm concerned about is if we curtail all human, greenhouse gas emissions, we just do that. It's still going to get worse because there's about a 25-year lag response to begin with. But not only that, we're setting off other things like now all these forest fires that are happening in this country and in Siberia and places like that. Plus, the warming of the Arctic and melting of permafrost and releasing methane. So there's going to be still greenhouse gases going off from methane release up in the Arctic, as well as the CO2 from fires. Eventually that will turn around, but I don't know how far down that road we're going to go before it turns around, because even if we stopped it all right now, it's still going to go down that road quite a ways yet. On the other hand, climate change eventually will correct itself regardless of what we do. It may take centuries for that to happen, but it will happen. And the other thing is that no matter how bad, let's say, simplification of the biosphere becomes or extinction events, the biosphere has been through at least 5 major extinction events we know about in the past. In the Permian extinction, something like more than 90% of all the organisms on this planet were believed to have gone extinct. And yet, each time that's happened, within about 10 to 15 million years, the biosphere has bounced back to have even more biodiversity than it had before that extinction. So in the long run, it's all going to be fine. It's, I think, the short run, and I'm talking now about longer time frames we're not used to as humans, but it's the shorter period we can measure in maybe a century or 2 or 3 that I think we need to really focus on how we're going to navigate that and how we can mitigate these impacts as much as possible. So there still are things we can do. And then the biosphere will kick in and it will set it all right again. That's the beauty of the system. It will fix it. It works on a different time frame than we're used to.
Put things in perspective. Yeah. So I'm going to offer one more question from a student, and then I'm going to pause and see if we can have some from the audience here. So as a professor at Antioch, what is one thing that you wanted to stick with every one of your students after they graduated?
I think that, when I taught our principles of sustainability class, and what I wanted to get through to people was that technology is a tool we can use, but it's never going to solve our problems. Every technology has negative consequences. As a matter of fact, all the environmental problems we're seeing today are all technologically related. They're all created by technologies we developed. And so if we're ever going to really get a handle on turning this around, it means we have to change our worldview. And it's not necessarily getting a new worldview. It's just going back to the one that guided humanity for 95% of its time on this planet. You know, humans have been around for 200,000 years. And for 95% of that time, we lived in hunting, gathering clan groups. And the worldview that came out of that was having incredible reverence for nature. Matter of fact, all these indigenous people saw the earth as their mother, and that all the other organisms that existed there were their kinship, that we're all children of Mother Earth, that we're all nurtured by Mother Earth. And so that meant incredible reverence and respect for nature. And then the other thing is having really tight community relationships in their clan groups. Robin Kimmerer calls what they had as a giving economy. Everything was given. So if any hunter was successful in a hunt, it was shared with everyone in the clan group, knowing that someone else would be successful would be shared back. The same with, someone who had a really good day gathering berries or nuts, it was all shared, knowing it'd be shared back. Because the well-being of the group was way more important than the well-being of any individual. And somehow we've turned that all around. We look at nature as being something we're apart from, that we have ownership over, control over, dominance, competition. All these things are really not healthy worldviews, and they've gotten us to where we are. And we've got to change our worldview if we're going to get back.
So, thank you. And as promised, are there questions from the audience in the front? And I may just have to repeat it because I'm not sure it will pick up on the mic. So say it to me and I'll repeat it.
So how would we delocalize in places like New York City or large cities? Because those places, obviously, industrialization has already happened. So migration to those cities has already happened and occurred. How would those places localize and how would they sustain themselves? Are they even sustainable?
Very interesting. How do we think about relocalizing in large cities like New York City?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have the answer. I mean, it can be done. I think it's, in a way, we can go back to the way we used to have neighborhoods in cities, which were more sort of self-reliant and work together. But, I think I don't really have the answer here. We missed the correct way of going. I think looking back, if we want, cities are really important and they can be very, very energy efficient. So they're a really important mix. But the ideal model would have smaller cities, maybe like 500,000 people just surrounded by rural agricultural lands and natural landscapes, not suburbia, where the surrounding land could support the city. But with the size cities we have today, I don't see how they get through this. I really don't. They take up so much energy and materials from so far away, which means really big transportation systems and stuff. So it's something I don't have an answer for. I wish we had just, in our development mode, we had come up with a different model.
Other questions? Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So, also on that point, kind of, so how would relocalizing impact the United States on the world stage? How would we, should we actually maintain our geopolitical status as a world economy, as a world power, and how would we, prevent other world powers from taking advantage of the kind of the adverse effects on our economy through, I guess, removing a capitalistic system?
Interesting. I'm not sure if that picks up, but what are the implications of trying to relocalize on sort of the U.S. As a whole, sort of economically and geopolitically, in its relationships with other world powers? Would it put us at a risk or disadvantage if we relocalized and also shifted our economic system perhaps away from growth?
Well, when I talk about this, I'm not just talking about the economic system. I'm talking about the socio-economic systems. They're completely tied together, and our whole geopolitical thing is too. I mean, this is now basically a global capitalist system that's working here with very large corporate entities and stuff, and I do not believe it's sustainable. So I think it's not just that we have to relocalize and re-regionalize. It's a model that has to be happening across the globe in all countries. And how that plays out with new international relations and things, I guess we'd have to see. But I don't think we really have a choice in this. It's going to happen one way or the other. We're going to either be forced to do it because nature is going to basically, if we keep going down the road we're going, it's going to dismantle the current system, both globally and within a country like the United States, or we're going to figure out how to do this intentionally. Again, with citizens leading the way, and then municipalities and maybe states and things like that following suit with creating, policies and jurisdictions and laws that really support this. But it's something that is going to have to happen one way or another.
Go ahead.
Just trying to understand, so your life is devoted to environmentalism and understanding how we can be better people on this planet for the environment. I guess my question is, with all that experience, what would you say is like the first thing that you would change? Like if you could control like what people do, what would be something that you would want to see happen?
What would be the first thing that you'd like to see happen in people sort of changing their mindsets to be more,
Any action, any kind of
to be more environmentally sustainable? What would you like to see changing among
Well,
individuals?
I think the first thing wouldn't be to have one action that's environmentally sustainable, because for people that aren't used to even thinking about the environment or something, that's going to be difficult. I think the first thing is really recreating a robust network of mutually beneficial relationships in our communities. That can do a lot. Like, for example, I'll just give an example of this. One of my students started a time bank over in Brattleboro, Vermont. And in the time bank, it's a voluntary thing. You can volunteer to be involved. And what you do if you're going to be involved is you say, all right, here's a skill that I'm good at and I enjoy doing. I'm going to offer this into the time bank. It may be I'm good with a chainsaw and I can cut up cordwood for people, or maybe I'm good at mudding sheetrock and I enjoy doing that. Oh, I can't imagine that, but maybe someone does. It could be anything. And so let's say I like working the chainsaw to cut wood for people. If I put in 3 hours, then I can tap anyone else in that time bank for 3 hours of work. There's no exchange of money. But what's happening is we're creating in that process sort of an infrastructure of community relations that is really making the community more resilient. And not only that, by doing that, we can't have our entrenched views anymore. I might be doing something for somebody who has very different political views, but I'm going to start seeing them as a viable community member and that we can work together in mutually beneficial ways. Doing that, we can really start quickly decreasing our environmental footprint. If we can start working together, finding out ways we can support each other, supporting small local farms, things like this, we can really start reducing our environmental footprint, which then starts really helping the environment. But the key is we have got to become far less consumptive. We've got to become energy frugal, and working in communities to create these networks of robust, mutually beneficial interactions with community members can do a lot like that. Now, let me just give an example of this. During the Vietnam War, there was a lot of people that did not want to fund that war. And so what they intentionally did was brought their earning income level down to the poverty level, so they wouldn't have to pay any federal taxes. Well, 10 years after the war ended, someone decided to go back out and check on these people to see if they did that, because a lot of them went down, and they did this because they grew a lot of their own food. They shared resources with each other. Instead of each having a car, maybe a few families would have one car and share it. And so a study was done. They found that about 2/3 of the people went back up in affluency after the war, but about a third did not. And when asked, they all had the exact same response. They say, you know, I am much happier and fulfilled by life now at this lower consumptive level than I ever was. I have time in my garden. I have time for my music. I have time to write poetry. I have time to be with all the members of my community that are my friends, and I'm enriched by it. And I wouldn't go back to that affluent level that was so consumptive because my life was way poorer then. So I think, in a way, it starts with us in community, and that's where we can really start decreasing our footprint and supporting economic entities that have very small, sort of environmental footprints. And that's probably going to get the biggest bang for our dollar.
Thank you. I see a hand up in the back, Eric, and then Chris. Yeah.
How do you see the phenomenon of land ownership changing as, theoretically we would move toward this more communal society?
How do you see the concept of land ownership changing as we would move towards a more communal society?
It's a good question. I haven't really thought about that. I mean, I should mention that, like I said, for 95% of the tenure of people on this planet, there was no sense of ownership. We were participants, in a sort of a family existence. And so it is a sort of a radical change that we've been under for, some thousands of years now. And so I haven't really thought about how that might play out, but I think that eventually we would start to look at more communal ownership of just resources like air, water, things like that, become, things that not just human communities, but all organisms, have a venture in. So it's a good question. I guess I'll have to put some more thought to that.
Chris.
I'm glad to hear your comments, but you're obviously familiar with E.F. Schumacher's "Small is Beautiful" and that sort of economic plan. How do you see democracy fulfilling that, or your ideal vision? And where do you think artificial intelligence, if that was in control, would bring us?
Okay. Referring to Schumacher's "small is beautiful" ideas, how does democracy fulfill this small is beautiful idea? And what about the influence of artificial intelligence in the future of this pursuit?
Well, I'll handle the latter part first, artificial intelligence. I think that I really have a hard time seeing that going forward a long time forward. The reason is it is super energy expensive to get the materials, to make the computers, to run the servers, to do all this stuff. It's really, really energy expensive. So I was just reading the other day that, like, if we move to 5G globally, it'll boost energy consumption, electricity consumption globally 12% just by going for 5G. And so, AI is embedded in that and everything else. It's very, very energy intensive stuff. It's not like benign. And I think at some point, we're just not going to be able to go that route. We won't be able to do it. Either because nature will clamp down and will stop us from doing it with feedback loops. I mean, whenever one entity, if you look at an ecosystem, whenever a population starts consuming more than can naturally be regenerated within an ecosystem, the ecosystem becomes degraded, and the feedback from that just shuts that system down. It's not a question if that will happen to us or not. It will. If we don't change our ways, it's going to happen. There's no way around that. And the second law sort of is related to that. In terms of democracy and this, I think it is a democratic process, because if it's being run by citizens, they're the ones who are going to be making the decisions in terms of, I'm supporting this economic entity because they're small, they're local. I know I can see what they're doing is socially just. I'm going to support them, and I'm not going to support this large entity over here, which I, is a large multinational. I think that's a very democratic process.
We have come to 6:30. We've come to the end where I always make sure to let the students go so they get to the cafeteria before it closes. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us tonight, Tom, and thanks very much to the audience for your good questions. Please come back again next week. I'll stop the recording here.